So how do you make your current engine last longer than it already does? Well, there's care and attention that needs to take place. But have you ever heard of VVTi lines? That's a variable valve timing lines blowing up on Toyotas and Lexus products. How about rod bearing issues in Hyundais and Kias, BMWs, cracking timing chains? Every single brand and manufacturer has weaknesses and just ways that you can mitigate to make sure that engine lasts longer. Well, I'm going to share a list of 5 key tips that are going to help that engine last longer. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. One of the first most important criteria is taking care of your oil services. Everybody says it's the lifeblood of the vehicle, and that is literally as accurate as things get because oil is so important nowadays. It's not just there to lubricate bottom parts of the engine. I mean, oil is utilized to protect the rod bearings, the reciprocating mass at the bottom of the engine, the cam lobes at the top to keep everything moving and rotating nicely, all the internals, the piston rings that go up and down, gives you that proper seal, and everything stays wet, lubricated, and slippery inside the engine, which is a good thing. That's what you want. Most modern day engines now don't just use the oil to actually properly lubricate the inside of the engine. It uses it for a couple of other features. This engine here has a turbo over here. It's a 2-liter turbocharged engine. Now that oil has to be cleaned because the bearings that turn within the turbo housing are really tiny.
Tiny.
And if you have any debris or grit in there that can stall out problems or create problems within the turbocharger itself, result in premature turbo change. And of course, turbos aren't cheap. $3,000-$4,000 you can anticipate. As another key thing, most engines these days, including Toyotas, Hondas, BMWs, of course, Mercedes, you name it, almost every vehicle has some form of variable valve timing. In other words, it alters the timing of the system of the engine and the cam timing to allow for proper driving. So in other words, at low RPM, it retards the timing back a little bit so it gives you better punch off the go. But then as you accelerate, the timing advances and allows the actual car to breathe better and perform better at the top end. And it's constantly changing. And that variable valve timing has cooling lines, oil lines, feed lines, and they're running under pressure. And if you're using dirty oil, you can impact the health of those cooling lines. For example, the VVTi lines in the Toyota products, the Camrys, Corollas, all of the vehicles, for example, the 3.5-liter V6, we know that they've had a problem with some bursting VVTi lines. There is an update. BMW as well, their variable Vano system. Mercedes, everybody is running pretty much now variable valve timing. So if you don't have clean oil, you can actually prematurely add some wear and tear on the variable valve timing, turbochargers. None of those parts are cheap. Not to mention, if you have dirty oil, the engine can take a toll. But one thing that we have to remember, a lot of these manufacturers, Mercedes, BMW, a lot of them now are actually advertising you don't need to change your oil for 18, 20,000 kilometers. And car companies like BMW did extend those oil service intervals for the sake of marketing. If you tell a customer that you don't have to change your oil for 20 or 25,000 kilometers, people seem to like that. They get it in their head, it's going to cost me less money. But guess what? Dirty oil is going to cost you more money in the end. And even the argument of using good synthetic over Dino oil doesn't cut it anymore. Yeah, synthetic oil will actually do a better job of lubricating surfaces, internal engine surfaces at higher temperatures, and it'll hold up longer, but it still does break down. And more importantly, there's also grit and contaminants, oils, acids, grit, and materials that move through the system. As the oil starts to break down, internal engine parts wear, you get other components and sludge within the engine that makes its way through. That starts plugging up the cooling arteries and everything else. Nobody likes plugged arteries. That's not a good scene now, is it? There's a few things that you can do to limit that. Drop your oil service intervals down drastically. If the vendor's telling you 10,000 miles, do it 5,000 miles. That's my personal experience. Everything I've learned, by the time you actually hold off to do the oil service at the recommended interval, the oil is grossly dirty. So do it in half the intervals of what the manufacturer is saying, and you'll be much better off. The other part is that use quality parts. Don't go to Napa and use their base model filters. It has half the filtration often. Too much filtration can also be bad because you might build too much oil pressure in the system and it could cause other issues. So use the right specified oil filter. Use the right grade of oil because that's also going to save you a lot of troubles in the long run. And make sure that you're checking your oil levels weekly. A lot of vehicles like this, you can still check with a dipstick like this, and you could pull that out and you could put it back in, check your oil levels. And other engines nowadays, many manufacturers like BMW only does it digitally, so you have to check it on the dashboard. And I know a lot of people just like to wait for the oil service light pops up on the dashboard. Don't wait for that. What I'd suggest is you look in the owner's manual. Owner's manual is likely going to tell you what the typical oil service interval is. You go by that, cut it in half, do your oil service, and reset the oil service tender at that point. So you always have that reset, so you're never necessarily going over the correct mileage. The second tip that you can actually adhere to is going to likely help you extend the life of your engine. Don't ignore the warning signs. Do you have a weird sound in that engine? Is it making a weird noise? Is there a check engine light on the dashboard? Do you have something weird? Does it run differently than it has for a while? Is there something off? It's almost like your own personal health. If something's not quite right, you have to start thinking about that and ask the right questions. Go see a doctor. What I would say is do not ignore the warning signs. So if you have a check engine light on the dashboard, and typically where you'll find that, right in there you'll see the check engine light illuminated for a second. If you see that yellow check engine light on the dash, that often means there's something illuminating that. You have mass airflow, intake air, oxygen sensors. Some of these vehicles have as many as 4 or 6 oxygen sensors. You have a whole plethora of other issues that you could experience that could trigger that check engine light. And if it's left unmanaged, it could actually make the computer and the brain of the car alter internal settings, compensate for fuel, compensate for air, advanced timing, retard timing, even limp mode. None of those things are good, but that's what can actually happen as a result of a check engine light. Listen to the engine. Any weird sounds? A lot of 4-cylinder engines with double overhead camshafts often make a little bit more of a rattly noise. This one sounds pretty typical. What you are looking for is a weird sound that sounds out of sync. As the engine rotates, it should be a nice even sound, like a purring sound. But if you're getting kind of an uneven knocking or banging or something that's out of sorts, check that out. That could be a sign too. Don't ignore the warning signs. A third tip that can actually help elongate or extend the length of your vehicle's engine's life is reduce the strain on the engine, reduce the strain on the vehicle in general. I mean, all vehicles are made for go, yes, and a lot of vehicles are high performance engines and drivetrains, and a lot of cars and trucks and SUVs are made for towing and hauling in a more industrial or aggressive setting. The softer and more gentler you use that vehicle, the likely that engine will last a lot longer. One thing, of course, I want to talk about that is what's in here. Pop that trunk like that, and then look in the trunk. So do you have so much stuff in here that it's weighing down the vehicle? Keep luggage in the back of the vehicle to a minimum. Yes, sometimes you have to haul things across town. Maybe you have to move different cities, or you have to transport goods. That's just what it's there for. That's what the trunk's made for. But don't be one of those hoarders that's just constantly loading up bags of concrete, filling the trunk with junk that it's from corner to corner, back to front. Because if you go throw another 600 pounds of junk in the trunk, that means the engine just has to work harder, chug along a little harder constantly in a very chronic manner. Just keep trugging along. And of course, as well, it also takes a toll on the rear suspension. Often you have issues with alignments, tires wear out faster, brakes can wear out, there's more vehicle weight to actually slow down. So clearly, throwing too much weight in the vehicle is not a good thing. And weight is the enemy of performance and efficiency. So you definitely want to get rid of that. You could impose extra damage and wear and tear to the vehicle if you do it too often, consistently, and too much weight. But there's another part to this conversation. It's the way you drive the vehicle. We talk about restricting the strain on the vehicle. Let's just close this up and I'll explain that. All right, so the one thing you have to consider when you're driving a vehicle is obviously you're going to start it. Let's hit the go button on that. There we go, the car's running. Now this is your engine tachometer. This is essentially the gauge that tells you how fast the engine is rotating. Now that's your speedo, and of course, most people who have been driving cars typically know what these gauges are. But in summary, this here indicates the velocity, the RPM, the speed at which the engine's rotating. And right now we're at idle, so it's about 800 RPM. Most people suggest for casual driving on the roadway that you don't exceed much more than say 1500, 2000 RPM, typically just driving through the city, going from light to light, driving along. Don't really exceed 2000 RPM. What you don't necessarily want to do is driving at a much higher extended RPM, like 3,000 or 4,000 RPM. That will likely reduce the engine's lifespan in the long run. And yes, some people say, hey, the car has an 8,000 RPM red line. You can rev it up to red line every single time, but that's just not true, because the further you touch red every single time, you're getting to the rev capacity of that engine. engine, the loading on that engine, you're at a limit to the point where it's critical and you could literally sustain permanent irreversible damage to that engine. So definitely want to keep the RPMs at a moderate level. Don't want to lug the engine because too low at RPM, and typically you can impose some damage there too because it just bears down and it's hard on other drive components like the timing chain and some of the other components. You can also initiate more detonation and pre-ignition conditions. So what you want to do is keep it always in the sweet spot when you're accelerating 1500 to 3000, 1500 to 3000, idling long down the road, 1500 to 2000 RPM, just cruising along. Make sure you shift up if you have a manual transmission. Now the beauty is, of course, a lot of these modern day transmissions in these vehicles are great. They know, they're smart. A lot of these, they'll just always find that sweet spot for you to maximize fuel efficiency. And depending on the drive mode that a lot of these vehicles have on the dashboard, you just hit the button. Could be for economy, could be for sport mode. Sport mode will typically delay RPM shift up, and it generally means the RPMs will stay a little higher. But again, as I say, that will impose additional damage in the long run or deteriorate the lifespan. Remember, Formula One cars don't last for 200,000 miles, right? They're well built, but they won't last. Top fuel dragsters don't last for 200,000 miles. Engines that are designed for racing, high RPM, high load, high output, are not going to last. So you definitely want to, if you want to extend the life of the engine, keep the revs down, reduce weight capacity in the vehicle. So the next tip is really more around the entire vehicle, but we can specifically look at the engine as well. Generally, do not skip maintenance. Take care of all your regular scheduled maintenance, at least while you have the vehicle and it's newer and not in beater status. Of course, once the car's at 300,000 miles, you're just looking to get by day to day. But when you're trying to keep a vehicle longer and you're trying to extend its life from its earlier years, definitely take care of all the service maintenance. For example, we'll just start even with the chassis parts. You always want to make sure the brakes are in good shape. Check the brake warning layer right here. You always want to check, and what they can do is mic that disc, and you can tell the thickness of that disc. You also want to make sure your pads are within specifications, and as well, the same thing applies for up here on the front. Same story here. You have a set of pads in here. You want to make sure they're within spec. You can get a mechanic to do it, or a good DIYer can check that out. In here as well, sometimes feeling that lip is an indication that you might have some excessive wear, and it might be time very, very soon to change that disc. But you can check it with a micrometer, and you can just clip the thickness of that, and it'll tell you pretty quickly, as well as run out and general wear and tear and the scoring that you might find on that disc. So there's definitely some things you can check on the brakes. You also want to make sure you check and change that brake fluid regularly. That's the hydraulic fluid that runs through the lines that keep that, allow you to give you that clamping force on the brakes. If you get water in there, and eventually it does, just from heating, cooling, and excessive wear and tear, it does start to create spongier sensation in your brake pedal. So you want to make sure that you take care of that regularly. You also want to make sure another lifeblood of the engine is right here, coolant. You do not want to skip coolant services. Make sure this is always up to snuff in terms of level. Never make sure that it drops below the specified level. It's always got to be at the right level and the right type. Service manual can always tell you how much and what you need. Here shows you the indicator, how you can tell. It actually shows you how to check the level of it right there. It actually has a little bob on there. Many BMWs have a similar setup. Because remember, if you run out of coolant, you're guaranteed to overheat the engine, and with all the modern day aluminum engines today, you overheat it once, it's done. It'll warp and twist, and that engine's essentially throwaway, sometimes beyond being able to machine it. So you want to make sure it level's right, at the right level, and the right type of coolant. Right here we have the air filter. This ensures that you're taking cold, dirty air from outside, and it goes through the filter, and then that gets funneled right back into the engine. So you want to always make sure you have a good clean air filter, easy to check. You pull that off, check that once in a while as well, and don't neglect your air filters in there, as well as a cabin air filter. There's one there that's more for the passengers inside, so they're not breathing dirty air, but there's usually a cabin air filter tucked under in this area somewhere, or sometimes even in the compartment. You might find it under the dashboard. But cabin air filter is another one. Fuel filter is another important one, and we also want to make sure that all our brake fluids and hydraulic fluids are all topped up. So all your fluids should be looked at, changed regularly. Now, fortunately, most vehicles like this usually have indications. You have stickers, tell you lots of information that you need all over the place. You have information like this, the type of fluids you need here for air conditioning. You have all kinds of the other specifications and all the other stats that you might need. And often what's not in there is usually in the service manual. So definitely do not neglect your maintenance. And again, going back to the oil changes, do them much more soon than even a lot of the manufacturers even recommend, because they're doing it for marketing reasons. They're not doing it for the customer's best interest in most cases. And on top of just maintenance, the old term tune-up, remember the old Italian tune-up meant you fired the car up and you revved it, floored it a few times, you blow out a bunch of carbon out the backside, the Italian tune-up. But even modern day terminology of a tune-up isn't really right anymore. Tune-up back in the day, you could adjust carburetors, fuel mixture, and do all these things that could actually mean that the car would run better. That's a tune-up, you're making it better. But nowadays, these cars have computers that balance and assess and rechange and make constant changes dynamically to make sure the vehicle's running optimally. You don't really need to do a tune-up per se, you just want to make sure you're doing all the right servicing. Another thing, a lot of these engines nowadays have timing belts. Most of them are chains, but there are still a lot of engines that are running belts because they're quieter and they're relatively cheap to maintain. But $1,000 every 80,000, 100,000, 140,000 kilometers, usually in that range, is where they recommend changing those. Don't skip on your timing belt, because if it breaks, you could potentially have, with an interference engine, a valve and piston collision, and life's all over but the crying, and you're dealing with a new engine. So don't skip on the timing belts. That's equally important in the maintenance. And another huge tip is literally going to save you in the long run. Yeah, in the short term, you might not notice a difference, but believe me, if you plan to keep the vehicle for over 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and you just think because of the sheer cost of it, I want to make sure it runs for a long time, you have to take care of the simple fact of warm up and cool down procedures. Now, a lot of these vehicles are turbocharged. Of course, they have to have a proper cool down procedure. So if you're running hard, pull down into the roadway, let it idle for a minute, because the oil and the coolant still have to circulate and cool the turbo. The turbo's still slowly spinning, and you want to make sure you're able to dissipate some of that heat out of there. If you don't, you could coke oil around the turbo. It seizes. If you religiously misbehave and you run the car hard and turn it off right away, it wouldn't be long to expect 3 or 4 years and that turbo's gone. Remember, $3,000 or $4,000 for a new turbo could create a lot of headache for you. Proper warm-up is essentially too. Now, right now, we got really warm weather. It's about 20 degrees Celsius. You can pretty much start up this car, let it idle for 20 seconds, and then drive away. Now, with that said, everything's still cold. You want to make sure that it warms up the proper operating temperature before you really get into the gas, before you really throttle it, before you really floor it. But with that said, you don't want to idle it too long either, because if you idle your engine too long, when the weather's warm like this, you don't need to idle this for 4 or 5 minutes. That is actually detrimental to your engine on its own right, because it builds up too much heat within the heads. You start to melt away valve guides and guide seals, and then you start consuming oil. Not to mention, it could also start to plug off things like the catalytic converter with time. It starts to carbon up. Now with a lot of these engines being direct injected, you're almost guaranteed to start plugging off components. You want to get out there, warm it up, and then make sure as you're driving away, you're setting off nice and easy. Once the engine temperature is up to a reasonable temp, you can then start to really get frisky with the RPM and start driving in a more spirited fashion. So warm up, cool down procedures are absolutely essential for long life in a modern day vehicle. And with all of that said, right there, you're gonna wanna check that out. That's a video of some of the worst cars and the engines that's in those vehicles that won't even make it 100,000 miles. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you all real soon. Bye-bye.